Yeah, all right. Okay, well, I'm gonna go ahead and get started here, but good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Atlassian Community Event Chapter. I know that's a mouthful, but this is number, 13 or 14. Yeah, I think this is our 13th event. So good question. So we're actually fairly young, although once we hit the 1 year mark in August, we'll be old news, right? So we've been around for about a year. We're actually the only Atlassian group here in the state of Michigan. So we typically have these events once every month. We cover a wide range of topics within the Atlassian ecosystem. Most of them are product-based. Some of them are more conceptual-based. So Atlassian is a thought leader in teams and team dynamics and collaboration. Their software and their products are a component of that objective. But there's a lot of other stuff that they talk about that we try to sprinkle into our events. So for today's discussion, we will be talking about reports in Jira Software. This is a demo type of event. So for those of you that are unfamiliar, demos are the kinds of events where we will introduce you to functionality that's in the Atlassian ecosystem, but we won't go too deep into it. We do have another type of event called a deep dive. So if you do see that, just know that we're going to get down into the weeds as far as why things are set up the way they are. But we're going to just scratch the surface today. By the time this meeting is over, we're going to be, we should all be well familiar with the different reports that are available in Jira Software. So yes.
Tim, is the format of this, you want to run through your sections and well, can I just ask a question anytime? Or should I wait till certain breakpoints where you have a logical thought?
Yeah, that's a question. So don't let the setup here fool you into thinking that this is a very formal event. This is a community driven group. It's for the community, by the community. So anytime any of you have any questions, feel free to interrupt me and we'll have a conversation about it. So, and if you also have any knowledge you want to contribute to, just because I'm sitting up here in a high chair and I'm behind this thing, doesn't mean that, we should only ever hear what I have to say. So tell yourselves there. So with that being said, the things I want to talk about today, we're going through the introduction right now. Obviously, I'm Sam. Nice to meet you. For those of you that watch this recording later, I'm glad you tuned in. After the introduction, we'll be talking about the reports in Jira Software as far as what some of the caveats and rules are to reports, how they work, what are some of the parameters, and other housekeeping stuff like that. Then we're actually going to go through a reports walkthrough where we'll walk through each of the different reports available in Jira Software. And then finally, we'll conclude. Anybody have any closing thoughts? Feel free to contribute either at the end or anytime throughout. So does anybody have any questions before we keep going? Okay, all right. Sweet. So let's talk about reports in Jira Software. I'm intentionally limiting this event to just Jira Software because there are other Jira products such as Jira Work Management and Jira Service Management that offer their own set of reports. An hour-ish is not enough time to go through all of those. So I want us to walk away with some understanding. So we'll just be focusing on Jira Software. In Jira Software, we have the concept of boards. I think all of you here work in Jira Software. Is that correct? So yeah, so in Jira Software, you have the concept of Scrum and Kanban, agile frameworks for managing your development work. Fun fact, if you didn't already know this, there's no such thing as a Scrum project or a Kanban project. The Scrum and Kanban functionality lives at the board level. So if you look at the architecture of the Jira platform, you have your baseline Jira platform where your workflows and fields and other base configurations live. On top of that, you have Jira Software, which is installed on top of the platform, similar to installing an application on your phone. That gives you some, Jira Software specific functionalities such as your boards. And then your boards are available as part of Jira Software and they sit on top of your project. So the concept of Scrum, the concept of Kanban lives at the board level, not the project level. And boards are simply just a way to consume data that's within your Jira Software project. So you could have a Jira software project that has both Scrum boards and Kanban boards. That is possible. That is legal, not that the Atlassian police is going to come after you. So, yes,
Can
go
you
ahead.
give a definition of the scope of Jira software?
Scope of Jira software. That is a good question. Let me,
I'm just, that phrase, I'm wondering what the balance of that.
you mean like how it relates to the
Like,
entire
is it like,
ecosystem
we're
as a
talking about
whole?
Jira Cloud, Jira Server, Jira, like, oh, and then like integrations with Jira, like, I mean, like, I know, like, I can have like a lot in Confluence, I can have integrations with like Jira, like, where does the line like stop for that phrase, I guess?
Okay, so where does Jira software begin and end and,
It's integrations and, yeah.
okay,
Like,
gotcha.
just to, I know, it's kind of a dumb question.
Well, first off, let me just clarify, there's no such thing as a dumb question, except for the question that's never asked. So, don't feel bad about that. I do have a diagram pulled up here that shows Jira software in its relation to other products in the Atlassian ecosystem.
Yeah.
In response to your question about whether it's cloud or data center or on-prem, if you're familiar, Atlassian offers two versions of its products. One is cloud, which is hosted by Atlassian. The other is data center, which you can host on your own hardware. From a Jira perspective, it's going to be the same architecture for both in terms of the relationships to each other. The platform does include, like I mentioned earlier, your baseline configurations, such as your workflows, fields, dashboards, filters. Those live at the platform level. Jira software is installed on top of that, so it gives you access to that functionality, but it also gives you functionality that's unique to people that work in a DevOps environment. So the biggest takeaway from that is, your Scrum boards, your Kanban boards, that's something that's available as part of Jira software.
Okay.
You won't see that in any other product or any other Jira product. And then of course, you have integrations out to external systems such as like your CI/CD tools. That's something you can easily integrate with your Jira software project. Confluence is another Atlassian product that hooks into Jira software, but it is a standalone subscription. So you can, relate those two together, depending on how far you want to go.
Okay.
So,
I think the reason why I asked was because I know a lot of the times I'll have like, I guess the other high level question that I was like in my brain head, but I didn't want to hear it was like defining like how reports presented, because I'm thinking like sometimes I'll even have like they call them reports in the Confluence pages of like things that are generated from Jira tickets and that type of thing. And so I'm just like trying to understand.
I see. I see. So, okay. So like when we say reports in Jira software, you're wondering like what specifically are we defining as a report in the scope of this session?
Yeah.
Gotcha. So that's a good question. I'm glad you brought that up. So reports at the end of the day are just, ways to summarize your data, right? So you have the concept of filters where you can write a query and that will show you a list of data. That's not the kind of report we're talking about here. You also have the ability to configure dashboards, which are basically a bunch of different filters that display differently. That's outside of what we're defining as reporting here. When we say reports in Jira software, we are talking specifically about pre-configured reports that fall outside your filter and dashboard norm. And those are accessible by going to a board in your software project and then clicking the reports option right here. So when you click on the reports option right here, you can see that there are a number of different reports that are categorized as such. There are some pre-configured reports here that you can use to help you manage your processes. So this is what we're talking about
Yeah,
here.
that's what I was, okay. I probably jumped the gun.
You did not. You're good. You're good. Yes.
So these reports are different than what I want to get. What we run when I want to say, see how testing is going.
That is correct. Yes.
Those I just have listed on the side. They're like favorites, so to speak, but I didn't put it what I want, criteria in there or anything, just see what I want.
Right.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So the question was asked, are these different, are these reports different from, what's being used for like testing? And in this case, yes, because I'm familiar with the situation behind that question. So yes, we're just talking about the standalone reports that are available for a board when you create a board. So good question. So as you saw, when I navigated to that page, I had to first go into my project. And then I had to go to a board, and within that board, there was an option for your backlog, your board, and then right below that was reports. So the reports we're talking about today are board reports, if you will. So they're driven by boards. What that means is that in a Jira Software board, you have the ability to specify what data should be included as part of that board, right? So any report that you're looking at in Jira Software is only going to display the data for you visually based on what is included in that board. So any data that's living in the same Jira Software project that's not inside of the board that you're looking at the report from, you're not going to see that data in any of the calculations. So just wanted to throw that out there. There are differences between reports that are available in team managed projects versus company managed projects. This is a cloud specific term. And, because we have a lot to talk about today, I'm not going to be able to get into the team managed reports that are out there. However, join our community, join us in the future. We can certainly have a conversation about those if there's enough interest. There are also differences in the reports based on whether you're using a Scrum board or a Kanban board. So what you'll see this in the reports walkthrough, but you have a vast the majority of reports that are available in Jira Software for your Scrum boards. Kanban boards, there's only a couple of reports that you can take advantage of. Most of the reports we'll be looking at today are available specifically for Scrum boards. So if you're in a development environment that's not using Scrum, that's using Kanban, then only a couple of the reports we talk about in today's session will be useful for you. Now, if you are working on a team that uses Scrum or, manages your work in sprints, then you'll learn a lot more from today's session. How many of you work in sprint projects? Just curious. So, okay. All right. So most of you should get some benefit from this conversation we have today. The last thing I want to mention is that how you map your statuses on your boards will affect the data that is generated in a particular report. So here's how this works in a report in Jira Software. You have your different board columns, right? You have your leftmost column, you have any number of middle columns, and then you have a rightmost column, right? Your leftmost column more or less should reflect work that needs to be picked up, right? In a sprint world, you've assigned it to the sprint, you started the sprint, nobody's picked up anything yet. Then your middle columns may vary depending on how extensive your development process is, right? So you could go from in progress to review, you could have a code review, you could have a testing cycle or multiple testing cycles in there. Those middle columns would represent your in progress phase of your board. And then your rightmost column is where you move tickets to when you're done. So in a lot of these screenshots we see, you're going to see, work that tells you what's been completed or what's not completed or what's in progress. Those calculations are derived based on the columns on your board and the status is mapped to them. So anytime you see like completed work in a report, that's going to be, that report is going to be looking at all of the data that's in your rightmost column that you've deemed as done. And then the same would be true for to do and in progress. So that does play into some of these reports because, you change some of those column mappings and you could see different data in your Jira Software board report. So some housekeeping items there. There's a lot more than, that goes under the hood than what's listed here, but these are some of the key factors that come into play when you try to generate a report in Jira Software. Does anybody have any questions about that? So, okay, all right, let's move on. So now we're going to do our reports walk through each board or each report, and we'll describe what it is, how it's calculated to an extent, and some other interesting facts you need to know. We'll start with the very popular one, sprint burn down report. How many of you are familiar with the sprint burn down? How many of you use the sprint burn down on your teams?
Before, not currently.
Before, not currently. Okay. So a sprint burn down will track the amount of work that is remaining for your team within the time box of your sprint. So you have a line of best fit, which is reflected by the gray line right there. If you were to work at a certain pace consistently throughout your time box, then working against that line is going to help you stay on track. We all know that that's oftentimes not the reality, right, of the situation. And so the red line will actually show you how you're burning down as you progress through your sprint. So with this red line right here, you'll generally see like a descending step, if you will, if your team is getting stuff done, right? There's a lot of caveats that I'm throwing in here. So ideally we want that red line to drop, right, as time passes. There may be times where you see that red line shoot up. That means that scope has been added after the sprint has been started. That could be changing the estimate on a ticket. Like, let's say you change a story from a 3 to a 5. You'll see that, spike go up, right? We don't want those as much as possible. But again, we're talking about ideal and, looking at it from the lens of reality. So, when you see the red line go up, then, we can see that the scope of the sprint has been added to. And yeah, I mean, at this point, as time passes, it just works its way through to the end of either the sprint or until all your issues are complete. In my years of working on and with development teams, I think only one time I've ever seen the burn down line appear below the line of best fit. How many of you have ever worked in a sprint where the red line was close to the line of best fit or below it? Okay, so there's hope. What about you? Oh, you haven't? Okay, so you don't know. Okay, all right. Well,
Do all your tickets commonly close around the last day?
I don't know, I don't really watch it that closely.
Okay.
Like pick up tickets and do.
okay, all right. Yeah, you've never had to worry about it before, right? So why worry about it now? Yeah. So it is possible. But of course, this is just a reflection of the reality of your team. Other things to keep in mind. You don't have to calculate your sprint burn down specifically based on story points. So you have the ability to switch this drop down to whatever estimation statistic you're using on your board. So that could either be story points, that could be the original time estimate. It could be a custom number field that you've configured for whatever reason. So you have some flexibility there. You have the ability to show or hide non-working days. So these vertical gray bars you can choose to either appear, which reflect the weekends, versus, not having them appear. In this case, by showing the non-working days, I can see that a lot of work got done over the weekend. So this team was really trying to hustle. And, as I mentioned before, these are commonly used. So just by looking at this example burn down right here, we were able to identify a number of things that were going on that happened within this team, right? And that's really where the power of, the sprint burn down and other reports come into play, right? So that's the sprint burn down. Does anybody have any questions at the burn down? All right, okay. Let's go on and talk about the sprint burn up. A little bit more optimistic sounding here. But while a burn down works its way to the bottom of the board, burn up, of course, goes the opposite direction. You still have your line of best fit that comes into play, but the key difference between the burn up report and the burn down report is that the burn up report will track your rate of completion, and it will also show you your rate of completion compared to the scope of the sprint. So there's actually two metrics that are being calculated right here. The green line represents the progress your team is making as they resolve your issues in your sprint. So anytime you move a ticket or issue over to that rightmost column to done, then that green line should go up. That's your completed work metric. And then your work scope reflects the total amount of work that you have committed to as a team. So what this does is obviously you want your green line to catch up to your red line as soon as possible. But you can see here where scope creep kind of comes into play because, when on this particular day for what was slated for this sprint, we had this amount of work and, we added more work to the sprint. That's more scope that was added to the sprint. So we see an increase in the red line right here. And it just keeps going and going up until it reaches the top. So the red line will help you track scope and how it increases. That can help you as a team, identify, hey, are we not able to complete our work that we're committing to because there's a lot of scope creep, and then that'll help drive some additional conversations there. What's nice about this report is that, in addition to the line of best fit, you do have a little bit of a projection. So this dotted line right here is your scope creep projection, which basically says, if you don't add more scope to the sprint, right? If you're not increasing your estimation values after a sprint has started, then this should be the upper bounds of work that you should be committing to, in your sprint. So there is a little bit of forecasting there. But again, the takeaway here for a burn up versus a burn down is you're looking at two different things in a slightly different way. And you can, again, have additional conversations there. Like a burn down, you can select which sprint you're looking at. You can also select how you want to calculate this, whether it's by story points or some other estimation statistic. And this burn up chart, because it is prefixed with the word sprint, is only available for your Scrum boards.
So no scope increase in the entire sprint, what would we expect the red line to?
Exactly how it is right now. So I mean, as we get to this point in time, this dashed line should become solid as you move towards the end of your sprint.
So if from the beginning of the sprint, no scope increase, it would just be a red line all the way at the bottom.
It would be a red line at the top. Yeah, so it's going to change. The axes are going to change based on the data that's assigned to a sprint at a particular point in time. But if I was looking at this burn up report on like November 4 or November 5, this line that appears like in the bottom quarter of this graph would be at the top, and that y-axis would be expanded.
So the red line would be your total story points at the start. So if we had 20 story points at the beginning of the sprint, you would see a red line all the way across it.
Yes.
So the red line is essentially showing how the ceiling changed, basically?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then, so the green is you're just trying to hit the middle line at each point, and so like you're trying you're seeing, sorry, I'm just.
You don't need to apologize, yeah.
So like,
Yeah.
so the gray would be like, I'm just trying to think of like, at a point in time reference, like, so say, let's look at, November, 6th. What would we expect the max story points to be at that point?
The max story points on November 6th would be 20.
Would be the 20, and so we're trying to reach the 20 on November 6th.
That's correct.
Okay, and then we just see how it jumps by an additional like 4 or 5.
That's correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, sorry, I'm just, yeah.
You don't need to apologize. We're here to promote understanding. So yeah. Just out of curiosity, how many of your teams or how many of you have either encountered a sprint burn up report before, or how many of you have had a team use a sprint burn up?
I've seen how scope has changed, but I never really like looked at a burn up. So like, I mean, I've definitely had discussions where a burn up would have been useful as a visual representation, but I just never even like thought of it.
Right. Yes.
So when would you want to use a burn up list? Is there like any case where you prefer one?
I think both are useful. It's again depends on what data you're trying to resolve or analyze for your team. A burn down is good if you want to see like how much work is left, right? Burn up is going to be more like, hey, I'm more interested in the scope and how the scope may have changed over time, right? So
So especially if you're like, so I'm gonna give a random, like, say you're in a sprint and the size of the sprint keeps changing and you want to be able to like illustrate how that's causing an issue of being able to like reach completion, because either tickets keep expanding, like we reach-point in the middle of a sprint, and like, I mean, I can, hopefully nobody,
hopefully no one does, yeah.
reach-point in the middle of it,
Right.
you know what I mean? I'm just trying to think of the occurrences which would cause the max scope to increase. So either more tickets get pulled in, or certain ones get repointed too late. And so it's just like to illustrate, since we started the sprint, like this is how much our target changed.
Yes.
That's okay.
Yeah, I mean, and I mentioned earlier when we were talking about the burn down, you can see where scope creep happened, right? You see, but you can only tell that scope changed when the amount of remaining work goes up.
Yeah.
But it doesn't tell you much more than that about the scope, right? I can look at this and I can say, oh, the inclines in the red line tells me that there was a change in scope, but I don't know by how much, right? And, in this case, so somebody could have changed a story from a 3 to a 5 and then immediately resolved it right then and there, right? So this is the burn down is more focused on like your team and how they're progressing, whereas the burn up, it has a component that focuses on your team, but it also helps you focus on the scope for that sprint as well. So I would use a burn up if I wanted to track that scope and how it changes throughout the course of a sprint. So,
Especially if you're trying to make a case for like, okay, well, we need consistency to be able to like meet our deadlines, or something like that. Yeah.
right. Yeah, if you needed consistency to meet your deadlines, I'm repeating it for whoever watches the recording. So yeah, I'm not trying to sound more intelligent by taking your phrasing for you. So
And I'm in the burn up. In November 4th, what is the number of points that they are including in this sprint?
So, okay, in November 4 and the burnout, the question is, what is the number of points that were being included in the sprint? So like what the total commitment was?
Yeah, because to me, it looks like you're at 5 and then it goes up to 23, but by the time you get to the 7.
Right.
Seems about right.
So then how does the line for today, how one's way up higher than the other? Is it trying to say? See what I want to say. So the work completed is way below what it needs to be to, right, at this point in time, to keep up with, to get this sprint done.
That is correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because the way they both stop, I thought you were saying, okay, they're both right where they need to be, even though, the red's up at 23 and the other one's at 9.
Yeah, I mean, if I were to look at this last point right here, we're looking at, there are 23 points in this sprint, and out of that, only 7 or 8 points have been completed, which, yeah. So, I mean, not bad given the time box of the sprint.
So the work completed is 8, it's telling me, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. Whoops. I was trying to interact with
So
it.
inversely, I guess, like, saying like, let's pretend like adding resources to a project was just sheer benefit and that there isn't any other like conversation going on there, because to simplify the conversation. If we hit the max amount of points and we pull in scope to like, to be able to show like how much, more we accomplished than what we expected, this would also probably be a good report for that as well. Just I mean, in the inverse way, I mean, usually it's probably not necessarily that way, but say you pull an extra that has total familiarity with projects, and like you're able to increase the max amount of points that we're able to accomplish that sprint to be able to see what, well, at the beginning expense, the sprint, we were expecting this,
Right.
and then we
Right.
achieved this because, I don't know, something like that.
Mhm.
Okay, anyways, I know you have much more.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is good. If we don't get through everything today, then I'll have a part 2. So that's not a problem. I will take that. Any other questions or comments about the sprint burnup before we move on? So, are we burned out? Just kidding. That was bad.
So,
That was very
so
bad.
one really good use of this burnout could be to continually track the velocity, because on this you see your expected work in the gray line. And then the green line is coming close to it, so you have pretty much your expected velocity, maybe a little bit below. But you see that huge stroke increase. So you're saying these are the number of story points we're still doing, whereas in your burn down chart, you would never see that. You
Right.
perhaps might see a straighter line all the way across, even though your team's velocity was way higher.
Right. And we would expect some overlap between the two different types of reports, right? Because they are essentially showing the same thing, but just in a different direction. So, the nuances between when you do one over the other are nuances, right? But again, this report is available if you need to use the information on here to drive specific conversation. So, all right, let's talk about the sprint report. So the sprint report is a Scrum only report, only available on your Scrum boards. This is essentially going to be a summary of what happened in your sprint. So it does include a burn down. The burn down is not interactive because, it's a snapshot of a previously completed sprint. But you can see just looking at this team, like with a lot of sprints I've seen, there was definitely a Hail Mary at the end, right? To try and get things done. We're all familiar with that, whether we were a part of it or not. But the sprint report also does include some information below that burn down snapshot that kind of just gives you a tabular summary of what happened to the work that you said you would commit to. So it'll show you a section for all of the issues that were completed. You'll get basic information at the bottom here, such as, your key and summary, as well as the story points for that particular section. So in this case, if I look at this slightly blurry screenshot right here, I can see that 36 story points were completed in the sprint. And if I, compare that to where we started at, looks like we're at 40 points. So we almost got done. We just left a little bit of work on the table for whatever reason. Below this section of completed issues, you would see another table that will show you all of the issues that were not marked as complete. Now, remember what I said at the beginning. A report on a sprint board will determine whether something is complete or not based on whether or not it exists in that rightmost column. So if I looked at the incomplete issues for this sprint, then that tells me it was in either that leftmost column where it wasn't picked up, or it was in one of those middle columns. So that's just a nice way to summarize or to see a summary of what happened in your sprint. And if your team does sprint reviews or retrospectives, this is definitely a good artifact to bring up if the conversation allows for it, because then you can say, this is what happened over the last 2 weeks or the last 3 weeks. Talk to me about what happened. Why did we not get this stuff done? And then, that can help drive a retrospective in that area to hopefully set you up for success in upcoming sprints. But that's essentially what the sprint report is. Gives you a burn down, gives you a summary of what was completed and what was not completed. If there are any issues that were added to the sprint after the sprint was started, then those will appear in either your completed or not completed tables below, but they'll be marked with an asterisk to let you know, like, hey, we didn't originally plan for this. This was added midstream. So you can identify those changes that happened mid-sprint by looking for that asterisk. Does anybody have any questions about the sprint report? Have any of you used the sprint report in like a sprint review session or a retrospective? So, okay. If not, it's never too late to start, right? All right, let's talk about the control chart. So remember at the beginning, I gave you a disclaimer that this was a demo and we were just going to scratch the surface of reports. This is one of those reports that has so much documentation behind it that we could spend 1 or 2 of these events just talking about how to use this report, how it's calculated, and all of the nuances behind it. There is, when I was looking at the scroll bar for the page that's, for the Atlassian documentation on this report, it was tiny compared to some of the other reports. So I was like, okay, I need to figure out what I'm going to share about this with the event in this forum.
So you settle down, there is a control chart available. Nice.
Yes, yep. So I'm settling down and saying there's a control chart available. Don't ask me any deep questions about this chart because I won't be able to answer you. I may not be able to answer you. No, actually, please ask away. If I don't know the answer, I'll be transparent and say I don't know the answer in a way that doesn't kill my self-confidence, right? But that aside, a control chart is one of those more useful charts that are available on either a Scrum or a Kanban board. So the first 2 we looked at, Scrum only. Control charts available for Scrum or for Kanban. If you're in a Kanban shop, a control chart will have more relevance to you than if you were in a sprint. And really what a control chart does is it helps you calculate the cycle time and lead time for your work. How many of you know what cycle time is or lead time? Okay, so cycle time basically tells you how long it takes to, I guess, how much work on average is put towards an issue. So if you have 20 tickets, cycle time for those tickets could be, 2-3 days, 2 days or 3 days, for example. And then that way, when you're having your, prioritization sessions or planning sessions, if you're looking at like doing forecasting and estimating, if you know what the cycle time on average is for your issues, you could say, well, I've got these 5 tickets I need to get done for this release within the next month. If the cycle time for each issue is about 5 or so days, then we're talking about 25 working days to get this done, spread out across team members. So that's really what the value of knowing that metric is, and how it's going to help you. So the cycle time is calculated by the amount of time that is spent working on the issue. So going back to that board visual, right? You have your leftmost column, which is your to-do column. Actually, I should do this in reverse. You have your leftmost column, which is your to-do column. You have all your middle columns in between that represent work that's being done on an issue. Generally, on a control chart, it's those middle columns that will determine what your cycle time is for a particular issue.
So basically the time that exists between those columns, so say, we're in progress, we're going to peer review, it's going back to in progress, it's going to peer review, it's going to deploy QA, and then it's going back to like the bounce, like all that, like all the time that exists in that time, is that cycle time?
Yes, that is correct. Yep. So the question is, if you have an issue that goes from in progress to review, back to in progress to another review or testing, is the time spent in all of those columns the cycle time? Yes, because the cycle time is really just trying to calculate, how much time is spent working on this particular issue. So on a control chart, when you are generating a control chart, you actually have the ability to specify which statuses to calculate on your issue. And so what you see here, this x-axis right here represents your issue transition date, which will tell you when a ticket changed statuses in your workflow. And the statuses that would be rendered as part of this control chart would be based on what you select. So if I have a workflow, or if I have like 5 or 6 columns in my board, and I only select 3 statuses within those columns on my control chart, then this data is only going to calculate based on those statuses that I select. So
say I had an on hold column, I could exclude that from being included in the cycle time because it's just sitting there waiting on some information or something like that. And I didn't want to include it in the
Yep. Yeah. So the question is, if I had a status in my workflow called on hold and it wasn't really a reflection of active ongoing work, could I exclude that from the control chart to get a better gauge of the cycle time? The answer is yes. Yeah. You can pick and choose what statuses you want to drive this report for. So when it comes to cycle time, selecting those statuses that are mapped to your middle columns is generally a good starting point, and that will tell you what the cycle time is. Lead time is a little bit more expansive than the cycle time. Lead time will include the time that is spent working on an issue, but it will also include the time, or that it also include the time between when an issue was first identified to when it is completed. So let's take, for example, we know that in our prioritization and planning activities, we may stand up and create a bunch of stories and tasks to complete. Lead time would start counting the clock from when that ticket is first created to when it moves through your middle columns. So going back to that board visual, lead time would include not just your middle columns, but it would include that leftmost column as well. So that'll help you decide, like, okay, if I create this, if I create this issue right now, and my lead time is 2 weeks, then knowing what that lead time is tells me that if I'm creating a bunch of issues right now, I can expect this ticket to go from now to completion in about 2 weeks. That's what your lead time is going to tell you. So it gives you that little bit of extra information to say, how much time is going to be spent in this leftmost column before it gets prioritized and it gets moved up and then it gets picked up by a, developer or another team member. So that's really the caveat between the two. They're both very important metrics. And this control chart will help you identify that. So speaking of the control chart, let's talk about what exactly we're looking at right here. The red line is going to be your average cycle time or lead time. I'm just going to say cycle time for the sake of this conversation. So in this case, looking at the screenshot right here, for all of the issues that are included in this control chart, I can see that the average cycle time is about 2.2 or 3 days, 2.2 days. So that tells me that the amount of time that is spent working these issues on average is about 2 days. Now, the blue line is called your rolling average. So your rolling average is going to give you a more targeted reflection of what your cycle time is for a subset of issues. So how this is calculated, it's going to take a single data point, a single issue. So let's say you had 10 issues in your control chart. The rolling average for a specific data point will take one issue. It will calculate the cycle time for an X number of issues before that issue and X number of issues after that issue. And it will calculate the average cycle time for just that subset of data. And then it's going to plot that on your blue line right here. What that blue line is telling you is that at various points in this timeline, the closer your blue line is to your red line, that tells you that the cycle time for your team is close to what you expect, what you would expect if you were trying to forecast like, a completion or an end date, right? So if I'm tracking a release or version that spans multiple months, if you will, right? I could look at a control chart and I could say, looking at this, it looks like, when my team started out and they are, they're kind of all over the place and there's no level of predictability to getting this work done. But as the timeline progresses, I see that rolling average get close to the average. That means I can say with more confidence that the cycle time metric that I have is going to be more accurate. Does that kind of make sense? It's a lot of word mumbo jumbo I just threw at you. So I'll just acknowledge that right now. But to determine like how much confidence you can have in your team, you want that blue line to get closer to your red line as realistically as possible.
And I can see at the beginning of it, like, possible like reasoning, like, oh, like people were on vacation during that period. So like got chaotic and you can see when they came back, it stabilized.
Right. Yeah.
With this chart, like where does lead time, how do you read that? Or does this example have lead time included?
So for this screenshot, it doesn't show lead time. Remember, lead time and cycle time, that's just based on the statuses you include in your chart. So if I wanted to look at this control chart and I was specifically looking for lead time, then when I'm generating this report, I would select the status that's mapped to my leftmost column.
Oh, okay, so you look for one or the other.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So then the whole blue section would either include lead time or wouldn't.
Yeah, it depends on what you configure the control chart to show you.
Okay.
Yep. Speaking of blue, that blue shaded area represents the standard deviation. So the narrower that band, the less wacko or crazy the work is happening in your sprint, and the more you can trust the data within that time frame. So that's really all that is showing. Is there anybody here that has used or looked at a control chart before today? Okay.
I could see it being useful now that I'm on like a maintenance project, like because lead time, being able to calculate that and display that in a way, especially when we have SLAs to meet, like it's kind of cool being able to. Like,
Right.
Like, it'd be interesting to play around with one.
Yeah. And this is important, and this is useful in a Kanban environment because Kanban is more of a pull system, right? So you don't have that time box, you have like a task box, if you will, right, where you limit work in progress. So this is where, while you don't have the time box to help you like predictably determine what your velocity is or anything like that, knowing what the cycle time is, you can at least forecast or project when you expect a version to get released. The question?
So what are the green dots? say? What do they represent?
The green dots represent, yeah, that's a good question. I'm glad you brought that up. The green, each green dot, if it's a hollow green dot, it represents a single issue. So if you hover over that, that's going to tell you what issue is calculated there. So you can see, like, for this green, data point right here, I can see that the cycle time or the lead time, whatever I'm looking at here, is 4 days. But compared to, the other issues surrounding it, I've got a 4 here, I've got like a 3 here. I can and I can use that and start looking at the blue line to determine, like, what is my team's effectiveness given these data points right here.
Can you describe this in single issue again? Like, when you say a single issue, do you mean like a single, like that's a point in time, like a ticket? You said that was a status change at one point, right?
A single, so each green dot is an issue. So if I hovered over it, it'll show me what issue is, there. It's like a data point on this plot. I'm not sure if I don't think that's answering your question.
But is it the single issue status closing, or is it changing, or?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, so if you look at this right here, this would represent the transition of an issue, because, like, from one status to another, and that's what this x-axis is here, right? So
any status within your identified columns, not
yes,
necessarily to completion.
that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, I can see here that this data point here is for an issue that was transitioned on this particular date. And that was the cycle time, calculated right there. If you see like a solid colored dot, that represents a cluster of issues that were close to each other, that they're just grouped together. So that is what that difference is. I do apologize that I don't have a more interactive example. It was hard to stand this up in a sandbox environment, but that's what what those points are reflecting on the graph. When you are generating a control chart, just some tips to keep in mind when you're looking for this information. As I mentioned before, select the statuses that you want to use to calculate your cycle time or your lead time. The other thing that I would recommend you do, just so you get a more accurate picture of your team, is exclude outliers. So you can see that this point right here, this is an outlier, right? This is well outside the standard deviation, but yet it is being used. Yes, yeah, you're right. You can see that the standard deviation is much higher because of this outlier right here. So I definitely recommend excluding your outliers. How do you exclude outliers? On your control chart, you have the ability to select whatever board filters you have configured for your board. So at that point, I would create a board filter that says, exclude outliers, and then either hard code the issues or use some other sort of data point in your tickets to classify whether something's an outlier. Click on that in your control chart. It will exclude that from being calculated in your data. It'll give you a more accurate representation of what your rolling averages are and your standard deviation. That's the extent of my knowledge for this conversation. There is a lot more on here. Like, they even, there's documentation that shows you how certain metrics are calculated in here. So maybe we'll do a deep dive in the future. Or if you're a statistician, I think that I said that right, statistician, then, you can come do the presentation on the control chart for me, and I will gladly sit and listen to you. So there's no strong opinion as far as whether this is only available for sprints, whether it's only available for a specific version. At the end of the day, it will start by showing you all of the information that's included on your Kanban board. And then you can further whittle that down to just quick filters. So if I have 200 issues included in my Kanban board and I apply 2 or 3 quick filters, I could create a control chart that shows me what 50 of those 200 issues look like from a rolling average perspective.
Okay, so you're just saying, like, it could you could filter based on certain issue types possibly to create them?
You could not filter based on, well, yes, you could filter based on issue types. Yeah, if you configured a board filter that said, only include stories or only include tasks, then you would create that quick filter, and then on your control chart, you would select that quick filter, and then that would limit your data to whatever issue type or other quick filter you apply.
Okay, so I was also thinking like, well, outliers, because like, if I could also like filter based on like stored ones equal to or something, you know, just to be able to like, well, big tickets to see rolling average of certain category of, you know, tickets.
Yeah, that's a good way to do it. Like, I mean, you could ask questions such as, you know, what does my cycle time look like for stories versus tasks? Or you could even get more specific and say, what does my cycle time look like for stories that I estimate at a 2 or a 5, right? And then that'll give you,
And I was thinking
Some
over
better
the life of the
information.
project, that'd be really cool for retrospectives, you know?
yeah, over the life of a project, yes, you could use that for retrospectives as well. And then that could help with, you know, forecasting discussions. So, all right, I'm going to move on because I don't want to talk about this anymore. No, you don't need to apologize. It's a lot. It's a lot. It's a good chart once you understand it, but it's one of those, you know, hurdles you have to clear. And I'll be honest, I haven't fully cleared it yet. So the cumulative flow diagram is another one of those reports that's useful for both Scrum and Kanban. You have 3 different categories here: to do, in progress, and done. Again, that's calculated based on your statuses and, you know, your particular board columns right here. What this does is this report will show you whether or not you have bottlenecks within a particular status. So if you were to just take this report out of the picture and you were to look at a board with X number of columns on it, how would you know if your board was experiencing some sort of bottleneck? Anybody?
I mean, maybe the issue would start stacking like the status.
Yep, exactly.
And you
So
see the dot increase at the bottom of the issue.
Yep.
basically.
yeah, so the 2 responses here were if you start seeing issues stack up in a particular column, and if you start to see that that staleness indicator, as I call it, it's actually called the days in column indicator, but you know, the more that grows, then the longer that tells you that, you know, this ticket hasn't seen any movement, right? But yeah, anytime you see work stack up in a particular column, which is mapped to a status, then that lets you know that there's a bottleneck. On a cumulative flow diagram, that's essentially how you're calculating the bottleneck, except how you would identify a bottleneck on this graph is whether or not you see a particular color growing vertically over time. So let's take well, this is not a very good example, and this was the clearest example I could get you. But let's say that in progress column is this narrow band of green that appears right between the orange and the purple. Yeah, you have to look really close, right? At some point in time, let's say towards the leftmost of that graph, you know, let's say that band was, you know, this thick. As you look at the cumulative flow diagram, it grows vertically as time passes, right? That's essentially your column stacking up with issues in that status, right? The difference between identifying bottlenecks in a cumulative flow diagram versus looking at your board is that you can identify a bottleneck over time on a cumulative flow diagram because that information is tracked. Whereas on a board, when you're looking at bottlenecks, you're only looking at a particular point in time, right? The column could be cleared tomorrow, or the column could be cleared in a couple of days, or a column could be stacking up over time, right? If you wanted to know, like, hey, when did this column start stacking up? When did we start getting issues stuck in this status? That's where a cumulative flow diagram would be able to answer that kind of a question. If you wanted to like identify when a bottleneck started, right? On average, right? You know, you're not going to get it to an exact science, but you'll get a better indicator of it than opposed to waking up one day, going into stand up and realize, oh, shoot, you know, we've got a bottleneck here, right? If you need to do some more diagnosing, then you can figure out, oh, you know, last week, you know, we had a week-long team party and decided not to work, right? I mean, I know that's not realistic, but, you know, we can only hope for and dream. But based on our earlier burn downs, you know, we probably don't deserve it. That is what a cumulative flow diagram would be able to help you understand. It's really, it's useful for identifying those bottlenecks. So when you're looking at this chart, whenever a particular color grows vertically and it keeps growing, it is an indicator of a bottleneck. Other things you can do on here, you know, you can change the date frame that you're looking at in here. You can either do that through this drop down right here, or you can hover over this little overview right here across all time for your board and look at just a, you know, smaller date range instead of looking at it across all time. And then that'll help you, you know, probably see some of the green band here a little bit more clearly than what the screenshot is showing you. But yeah, this will show you the statuses of issues over time. There's additional reading on here that, you know, that we can get into at some point in the future. Maybe when we do that control chart discussion, we can get into that for this. But that's a cumulative flow diagram. Yes.
So do the areas ever shrink, or does it only go up? So is it based on the max number of issues in a column, or?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good question. So it's based on the max number of issues in a column, right? Ideally, like in this case, if done as purple, you'd want to get that purple to get closer to the orange, but you can see like it flat lines right here. So, you know, as long as this board is active, which we know if it's Kanban, it's going to be ongoing, right? Yeah, I should clarify, like when for identifying bottlenecks, you can see that, you know, the purple is expanding as time passes. That doesn't mean that the done status is a bottleneck, right? That's what we want. But if you see any other bands that are growing, right, then that's where you would want to quickly identify, like, hey, why is something sticking around in this status? But yeah, that's ultimately the intent, right? You know, your to-do column represents, you know, the total, if you look at the y-axis here, right, this is going to represent the total number of issues. So as you create more and more issues in your Kanban board, you know, I would expect that orange band to grow up. And that kind of is similar to what we saw in that burn up chart with that scope line, right? That scope work or work scope. I forgot what the name of it was. You know, we would expect to see like a staircase, if you will, that gradually grows. So the interest here is not necessarily in the, you know, top line of your to-do issues, but, you know, all the colors in between. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it almost seems like from the blue to the orange, that like zone is like what's interesting in seeing how they're relative to each other.
Mhm.
It seems like if I were in a sprint, say it was sometime in January, I'd want that sliced and see how they're distributed, right?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, yeah, it's very
over the lifetime, like there's different things to look at, but if I'm looking at like more in a week or something like that, yeah.
right. Yeah. And so the question is, like, you know, it probably would be this report would be more useful to me if, you know, I was looking at just a smaller time range. And yeah, if you wanted to see what was happening in January or even within a particular week, you have that ability to configure this report that way. So, all right, let's go on to the next report. So let's talk about the Epic report. Contrary to popular belief, this is not like the, you know, most outstanding, coolest report. That's not what they mean by Epic. This is actually referring to what issues associated to an epic will look like over time. So for some odd reason, this is a Scrum only report, even though epics are not a Scrum specific artifact. I think we have any Agile police in here? No, they're all at Agile and Beyond. So I can say that. So for any issues that are associated to a particular epic, you do have the ability to select that specific epic and just take a look at progress of your issues in that epic over a period of time. So you have a number of different metrics right here. Your total story points represents the, you know, lighter shaded gray area in this example. So that's like your, you know, upper bound scope of, you know, every time I add an issue to this epic and I put a story point on it, I would expect that gray area to increase along the y-axis, right? You have the number of issues, which represents that blue line that, should grow somewhat in proportion to the number of issues. You can see that, in this case, I could have, 150 story points, but that number of issues might not necessarily match like 150, for example, right? So it's its own metric, but that would show you the growth of the epic over time, that number of issues metric. The completed story points would be this lighter shaded area right here. So that would be tracking your rate of completion against the epic, not the sprint. And then, of course, your red/brown line here would show you the number of unestimated issues. So what's nice about this epic report is, as we all know, we create and identify work that is associated to a particular epic that we're trying to complete, but we may not be ready to estimate it yet, right? So because we need to have more discussions around it. So this report will help you identify that over time so that, you can monitor, some information that way. And then, of course, you have a tabular section underneath, very similar to like your sprint report. You'll have a completed section and you'll have an incomplete section, but this is just a way to visualize your work against an epic instead of a sprint. Does anybody have any questions about this particular report? How many of you have used an epic report in the past? No? Okay. Yes.
I have a general question. So isn't epic made up of like stories or tasks? How is what is it?
Okay, yeah. So that's a good question. The question is, what is an epic and what's it made out of? In short, an epic is really a group of issues. So think of it as like a parent. Parent is not the right term, but think of it as like like a super story, if you will. So like if you think about what a story is supposed to be like the smallest deliverable useful feature, right? An epic would be, something that's a little bit larger, right? So you could, what's a good example? Someone give me an example on a development team of what a good example of an epic would be. I'm trying to think. Construction. Okay, so you obviously wouldn't do this in like a development team, but let's say I had a goal to do the landscaping for my backyard. And as part of the effort to do that landscaping for my backyard, I have one piece of work where I spread the mulch, one piece of work to build a fire pit, one piece of work to set up like a drip irrigation system. This may or may not be related to what I'm doing right now. Those individual pieces would represent like your stories and your tasks. The epic would be the, completing the landscaping in my backyard. It could be like backyard landscape in 2023. So it's larger in nature, and I've got work that drives towards that epic, but it's too large to be its own task or story, if you will. Now, another part of your question was, is it a group of stories? Is it like just tasks? From a Jira perspective, there is no strong opinion. That's why I said an epic in Jira is really a group of issues. So you can include stories, you can include tasks. Atlassian is not going to, be like, one of those grammar police people and whack you for using them wrong. But it's just a way to categorize your work. So
Is there a variant of this report for releases?
I'm glad you brought that up. There might be. I actually forgot what my slides are.
I was trying to think of like, because I could see if I had several user groups in a project and like maybe their work was grouped by epics.
Mhm.
And like if I wanted to see the breakdown of how each epic, like each group's work increased and like how the issues increased and the scope changed, like and wanted to isolate it to an epic, I could see that being useful. But I could also see this really being useful as like across the release, seeing issues being added in, and if they're being added in quicker than the work being done, kind of, I don't know. I'm trying to like imagine scenarios, I guess.
Right. Yeah, and I have an idea to one day do a talk on like the differences between like your epics, releases, components, and other stuff like that. But But yeah, I mean, I guess in response to your initial question, do they have a report like this for releases? I think so. I can't remember what I have on my slides, so I'm kind of going through this presentation with you. But yeah, I mean, if you are building an enterprise-wide application, you're going to have sub initiatives, if you will, that your team's going to be tracking towards to getting completed, right? It could be the refactoring of a module, or it could be like, you know, implementing offline functionality, right? That could be a good example of an epic. You'd be able to track the progress related to that particular area using the epic report if your architecture is set up that way. So did that answer your question? I just want to make sure. Okay, awesome. All right. Let's go on to the next one. So there is a burn down available for epics. Again, I don't know why this is specific to Scrum boards only, but you know, that is just the nature of how it is. Unlike your sprint burn downs, you don't have an actual line. You just have a series of bars that, you know, ideally should get smaller and smaller as time passes. But let's look at what this report is like. So again, like this one is in the test. On the test. Oh, you're saying on the exam?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, if you're studying for an Atlassian cert, then this will be useful for you. If you have already gotten your Atlassian cert, then, you know, you're an expert right now, or you forgot the information, right? I don't know. So let's talk about the epic burn down. So at the end of the day, the epic burn down is to help you identify when you could realistically expect to complete all the work that's associated to your epic. This does differ in the sense that you can see here that the very first bar of your epic will show you the number of story points that are associated to your epic at the very beginning. As time passes, and this is driven by sprints. Okay, so earlier I said I don't know why this is sprint specific, but now I can answer that question. Each bar corresponds to a sprint. So that's why it's sprint specific. As you move through your sprints, we would expect that blue bar, we'll call it middle blue. We would expect that bar to shrink. So in this case, at the start of the epic, there were 15 story points associated to this epic. When I go over to looking at how much work was completed towards this epic, I can see that the blue bar has shrunk down to 13. So that would show you how many story points are left for that particular epic. That light green section at the top will show you how many story points were completed for that epic within that particular sprint. So green is good. It applies in this epic burn down like it does in real-ish life. Unless you look green, then that's not a good thing, right? So
Hey, green good. That to me, green is bad. I mean, you didn't finish all your work.
well, remember with epics, they will typically span multiple sprints, right? So green is good because it's chopping away at how much work is left to be done on that epic. So whenever we see green, that means that we are completing work for that epic. So in this case, if I look at sprint 7, there were 2 story points that were completed for that epic. And as a result, there are only 13 story points left for this particular epic, which I guess is big customer love. Interesting. I did not vet these screenshots when I pulled them in, but that's an example of an epic. I should have just gone ahead to the next slide to answer that question. So green is taken away from that bar. But we also know, looking at the epic report, that work can be added to an epic over time, right? So anytime you see this dark blue section appear at the bottom, that shows how much work was added to an epic. So in this case, in sprint 8, it doesn't look like I completed any work towards this epic, but I did add 2 story points to this epic. So now I'm back to 15. And then sprint 9, it looks like it was mixed because I had 12 story points remaining at the end of this epic. I was able to chop off 3 story points and get 3 story points completed, but I also added 4 story points worth of work. And then as I go to sprint 10, I can see that I was able to chop off 4 story points. So it is a moving, shifting target. This does track scope changes, as you can see. And you can see here that, you know, there is some intelligence applied to try and help you figure out, hey, based on the current rate of progress against this epic and the scope changes, here's how much time we think is left before you complete this epic. So in this case, for big customer love, I'm about 6 sprints away from achieving big customer love, right? And then it's also going to calculate that based on your velocity. We'll talk about velocity here in just a little bit, but again, if you're tracking work and progress against an epic burn down is a good report to use. How many of you have used epic burn downs before? Okay, all right. Yes.
So would there be like a type of rundown for Kanban, or does that just exist?
Yeah, that's a good question. An epic burn down for Kanban does not exist because as you can see on here, these bars are rendered based on sprints, and sprints are only a Scrum artifact. So that's why you won't see this for Kanban. It would be nice if we could like specify like a time frame, like instead of a sprint, show me 2-week intervals or 1-week intervals, and track work that way. But that's just not available right now out of box. But yeah, this report right now is Scrum only. So there may be some marketplace applications that close that gap and give you an epic burn down like feature that's not restricted to just Scrum boards. I don't know what those are, but that's a business opportunity. Hey, maybe as a community, we should do like a hackathon, put together an app and sell it, and then become a business venture. Actually, that work. All right, so let's talk about release burn down. So we've already talked about this with the epic burn down. Release burn downs, very similar. Again, sprint, Scrum only. This is only a Scrum only report. It works the same exact way as your epic burn down, but it is tied to a release. So I won't go through all of the specifics here. A couple of things I want to point out is that, whatever estimation statistic here that is used on this report is based on whatever you configure on your board. So in this case, looking at this screenshot, the estimation that's being used for this board is story points. But if you wanted to do, something based on time or calculate based on time, you'd be able to do that as well. Have any of you used a release burn down in the past? Have any of you seen a release burn down before? Yes, no, okay. All right. So now if somebody else asks you that question, you're going to have to nod your heads because you have seen that in this session. So yes, again, very similar to an epic burn down, works the same exact way. It's just a different set of data. Instead of looking at epics, it's looking at releases, right? So any questions or comments about release burn downs? Okay. All right, so we just have a couple more here. So let's talk about the velocity chart. The velocity chart will show you the velocity of your team. Everybody here have a good understanding of what we mean by velocity. Velocity just refers to, how much work on average your team can get done within a specific time blocks. So this report is only available for Scrum. It is calculated based on sprints. Each of those sections represents a sprint. The gray bar will show you how much work your team committed to at the start of the sprint. The green bar will show you how much work you actually completed. So very interesting metric here in the first part. We committed to a little, but we completed a lot. So we probably added more stuff during the sprint, like maybe a bunch of small work, like capitalizing, the first letter of every single word that's displayed on an application. Maybe, I don't know, but that's possible out there. So again, the estimation statistics are based on the board. So story points, time estimates, custom number fields, those can all drive this report. The velocity chart will only show you the velocity for the last 7 sprints. So if you've been on a team that's been working for, over half a year or longer, the velocity chart is only going to show you the last 7 or so sprints. So 2-week time boxes, 14 weeks, 3.5 months is what data you would see. And that would make sense. Of course, you don't want to go too far back because we know teams change and, work changes. So, You definitely just want to be looking at a more recent set of data.
That's what I was thinking would be also possibly a useful, like metric to be able to capture, like this report is like, just in capacity.
Mhm.
Like if resources change or. Sometimes like springs are affected probably by holidays and stuff, but I guess if we have a small enough scope, it might kind of negates the need to assess that as much.
Mhm.
Sorry, I'm just.
No, you're good. Yeah.
I'm just trying to like think of like, what would be a good way, because I've used this a little bit in the past, but like to interpret capacity alongside how velocity is changing, I think is like useful. But I think that's where it's kind of a struggle sometimes is to like be able to like visualize all of that together.
Right. Yeah, and at least when it comes to capacity, I feel like that's a historically weak point for the Atlassian ecosystem. They have some functionality there, but they don't get as into it as, say, other applications out there. That's partly intentional, partly not. It's just its own rabbit hole, right? How specific do you want to get with capacity management? With the velocity chart, all this tells me is how much work is completed, but it doesn't give me insight into, was there a staffing change? And so as a result, we were able to, complete what we said we were able to, or stuff like that. You're not going to get those insights from here, but you'll get.
Working days, less than days.
Right. Right. But at least with this report, you'll be able to get something that you otherwise wouldn't have. So this will just help you analyze and say, oh, good sprint, bad sprint, what does this look like in recent history? Now, there is no like trend line here that would spit out like, hey, this is what we think your average team velocity is based on the last 7 sprints. That's not listed here, but just by looking at this at a glance, you can, come up with a specific metric for forecasting purposes. Yes.
So this velocity chart wouldn't exist for like Kanban board because you don't have time boxes, or is it just from only sort of product, right? Is that
Yes. Yeah, that is correct. So when we calculate velocity, we need to, set some sort of boundary, right? With Scrum, it's a time box. With Kanban, it's a, task box or work in progress box, if you will. So generally, when we talk about velocity, we talk about how much work can a team get done over a specific period of time. And so that specific period of time part is what makes the conversation around velocity more Scrum specific. If you wanted to do something like that for Kanban, while there is no explicit velocity chart, you could go back to that, control chart view, right? Calculate average cycle time and then, do some creative metrics there to get something close. But again, velocity is more a time box artifact. So does that answer your question? Yeah, sweet. Awesome. All right. And then let's talk about the version report. So this is related to that release report you were talking about. So this is a little bit confusing, but in Jira, the word release is a verb. So you release something. The actual term that we casually throw around as releases is called versions. So this is a version report. In some context, depending on who you're talking to, when someone says release, they're probably talking about version, but just wanted to get that out of the way. Again, the version report is Scrum only. I don't know why this particular report is Scrum specific, because releases are definitely central to Kanban functionality. So don't understand why don't ask me, ask the Atlassian police when you run into them. But a version report will show you what the anticipated version release is going to be. So in a version, when you create a version for your project, you can specify a start date and an end date, right? And of course, when we set up these versions, we have an idea or a time frame of when we want to get that complete. You can take those start and end dates, cross-reference them with the version report, and then determine like what's realistic versus not realistic as far as being able to complete the work that I've currently associated to this version. So the blue line, the solid blue line there, again, reflects your ideal guideline for completing this work in a timely manner. The shaded areas represent optimistic and pessimistic views of how you could complete the work within your sprint based on, a number of different factors. So, if you are looking at the blue shaded area below the line of best fit, that is going to be your optimistic view, because you're staying under the line, and your story points or your estimation statistic is below. I think I'm saying that right. So someone that's smarter than me, tell me if I'm wrong, otherwise I'm going to mislead everybody.
Like above would be, like, what's the date earlier?
I have it backwards. Yes, it's above. That's the optimistic line. Thank you. Yes. I was trying to cement this last night in my head and drew a blank, but yes. So if you're above that line, that means you are completing your work, or you're hitting that ceiling sooner. So that's your optimistic view. Your pessimistic view is, of course, anytime you're below that line. So if I'm looking at this data point right here to get to, I don't know, 83 points of completion, instead of completing it around July of 2019, I am completing it around December 2019 or January 2020. So below the line is pessimistic, above the line is optimistic. I'm glad we figured that out in this session right here. Again, the estimation statistics are based on the board, so it doesn't have to be story point driven. You can switch between the different versions if you have multiple versions in flight that are overlapping each other. But one caveat that's specific to this report is that you do need to at least complete 10% of the work associated to this version before this report will become useful. Otherwise, there's no way Atlassian's going to know how to render your data. So you do need to complete 10% of the work, whatever, and then that's going to be based on the estimation statistic that you specified for your board. So 82 story points, need to at least mark 8.2 story points as complete before this report even becomes somewhat useful. But this is another way, again, if you're trying to forecast and identify, when could I expect to complete the work associated to this version, this is a very good report. And then at the very bottom right here, you see a lighter blue shaded area. I'm running out of different blues to reference here. So it's a good thing they're not different shades of gray, because that would have different implications. But you can see that this shaded area here would grow, and that would represent your completed story points. So again, if you're able to hit this blue shaded area and have that go above your line of best fit here, or your predicted completion date, then you are ahead of the curve. So not only can you track projections in this version report, you can also compare your projections for your version to the work that's actually being completed for that particular version. So it's actually a pretty cool report. How many of you have used this report in the past? Man, okay, well, whatever teams you're working on, please encourage your team lead to look at these, especially if you're trying to plan work for the future. So yes, Tony.
So, sorry, you might have described it, but could you go over like the two lines, like that segment that's being highlighted? Is that what you're using to create the predictive line going forward? Because I see the one says that one is supposed to be today, right? Like the two bars down, the vertical bars.
Yes.
I'm just trying to understand the differentiation. Is that the segment you're using to calculate out from? To get velocity and then you make the predictive line the rest of the way? Or I'm trying to understand what that segment is.
Between these two lines?
Or just what those lines are significant of.
Okay, yeah. So today is just, again, it's going to show you where you are at today compared to the rest of the projection right here. And then this lighter dash line shows you when the anticipated release date is for what you've set on the version. So in this case, the release date is September 14, 2015 for TIS 3.0. You can see that right here. I can see based on the work that I've assigned to this version, that there's no way I'm going to complete this version.
So this is saying that there's not gonna be
Oh, so that's the end.
4
part.
years.
Yeah, that's technically
That's why
when
I
you
was-
marked it.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, yeah.
Yeah.
So really, we get, we're like, yeah, like you're saying, 5 years off, 4 years off, okay. That's what was throwing me off. Okay.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So that,
They're the party group that.
this is the team that's obviously partying, right? But yeah, you can see here, and I'm glad you brought that up. So, you know, if you do set a release date on your version, right? It's going to show you where, you know, you are in relation to that end date you specified. And you can see that, you know, we're obviously not going to meet that because the number of story points assigned to this version is up here at 80. So unless you have a Hail Mary happening here, which you're not for a party team, you need to, you know, adjust your expectations, right? And so this would tell your team lead or your team to say, okay, I either need to change the release date for this version to sometime later in the future based on what this report is telling me, or I need to cut the scope, right? And in this case, like if I had a hard release date of September 14 of 2015, then I would want to, well, yes, I'd want to get a whole new team, or I would take out, you know, about 72 story points from this version and assign it to a different version, right? So again, just by looking at this report, you know, aside from, you know, disciplining my team, I'm able to perform additional actions based on what this report is telling me. So that's where this comes into play. It helps you set realistic expectations if you have a realistic team. So that's going to be the running joke of this particular ACE. So any questions on the version report? Yes.
So does the estimate change based on the amount of work you complete? Let's say you complete 20% of the work. Would the estimate for like the line of estimate that change based on the work?
Oh, yeah. That is a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I think the answer is no, because you have an optimistic view right here. So, you know, after you've completed 10% of the work, you know, Jira will try to give you a forecast. And then, you know, if you get more aggressive and let's say you complete 20, you know, when the graph was saying you only need to complete 5 to stay on track, then you would see this blue shaded area right here jump up above that line of best fit. So, you know, you could see that blue shaded area be a little bit more steeper than your optimistic view. And that's your hardworking non-partying team right there, right?
So if that little sliver of blue was at 20% instead of your 8.2 or whatever, then our lines would shift back.
Can you say that again?
If your little chunk of blue.
Right here, if the little chunk of blue right here,
Right, yeah, it's
Yep.
twice that size,
yes,
then your best fit line would be going back to the left. And everything else, because you have more done in that. segment time that they're estimating out there.
I don't know if this line of best fit is dynamically calculated based on the progress that you make.
Okay.
I don't know. My hunch is it isn't, because you have optimistic and pessimistic views that are rendered on this version report. So if this line of best fit kept being recalculated, I don't know the value that those would have, you know, if that line keeps moving. But again, I don't know. This is this so this is the takeaway to answer that question. Each of you will go back to your teams. You're going to start using the version report. You're going to, you know, test out this hypothesis, and then in 2-3 months, come back to me and tell me what the answer is. And then I will update this video with a YouTube comment letting you know what actually is happening with this report. Does that sound like a plan? Okay, or I can just research the Atlassian documentation. Get a hold of Mark. I don't know if Mark knows this anymore because he's been removed. Mark is a community member here, but I wouldn't know if he knows. So yeah. All right, we are a little bit over time, but I really enjoyed the discussion today. Does anybody have any questions or comments or testimonials over anything we talked about today?
So we just have to convince our teams to party in order to get that Get that chart.
We just have to convince our teams of party to get that chart. Yes, yes,
Or you go the route, but, you know, it's one of the.
yeah,
You show anybody that chart, you'll be like, oh.
Yeah.
right, right. So I hope that isn't the only takeaway from today's session. I know you're joking, though. I know you're joking. Does anybody have any other thoughts? No.
I mean, I think I asked.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you for joining us in person. And if you watch us online, I hope that you found this talk useful. You know, feel free to drop something in the comments and, you know, if you want to continue the conversation there, and we'll keep the conversation going. All right.